seated, please.
Amen.
Good morning. We have a bunch of visitors here. It's always good to see visitors. I mean, it's good to see everybody, but it's really good to see visitors. It's good to have everyone here worshiping together this morning. If you were here last week, you might remember Jared preached a sermon to us about the idea of telling the next generation. And he used the example of passing the baton. He asked the question of, what is it that makes a good Olympics? What is it that makes a successful Olympics? And he made some really great points about that and tied that in really well with the idea of us passing the baton to the next generation. But I got it stuck in my head thinking about the Olympics. I mean, I listened last week, really, I did. But throughout the week, I got to thinking about and I ended up thinking about what makes a successful Olympics, and I got stuck on the 2004 Summer Olympics. And I was thinking of those 2004 Summer Olympics. That was our first year in Illinois, and I watched a lot of that on my own, kind of, but it seemed like a terrible Olympics. I mean, there was all sorts of doping scandals. The U.S. Cycling team had, it seemed like every other day you're hearing about somebody else tested positive for drugs. But the worst thing about it for me was the U.S. men's basketball team. U.S. men's basketball team, if you recognize it, you got Allen Iverson, Stephon Marbury. Down there you see that LeBron, whatever his name is, that one guy that thinks he's really good. Tim Duncan, these guys were great. They lost the first game to Puerto Rico, lost to Lithuania, and lost to Argentina. And they get the bronze. And because of that, I think, man, this was just a terrible, terrible Olympics. Or was it? When you look a little bit closer, turns out it wasn't that bad of an Olympics after all. The U.S. won 35 gold medals, won 103 overall medals. It was an awesome Olympics. We won everything. But I was so focused on those two or three things that didn't go the way I thought they should go, that to me it wasn't a success. So what is it that makes us successful spiritually? What makes or what determines spiritual success? Too many times we can get focused on a whole bunch of different things and we can forget the main thing. Sometimes as churches, our focus becomes attendance. How many people do we have? What are our numbers? Are our numbers going up? Are we filling the building? That's important. Sometimes our focus is, what's our bank account? Like, do we have enough money to do stuff? Do we have enough money to do the things? That's important. Sometimes it's how do we influence our community? All that's important. Sometimes individually, we might determine spiritual success as, have I memorized any verses? Am I trying to memorize Scripture? All of that's important. Am I being evangelistic? Have I shared my faith with all of that is important. But sometimes we get so focused on all those things we forget the main thing. Well, what is the main thing? Sometimes it comes down, our spiritual success, our spiritual well-being, sometimes it comes down to a battle of wills. It's like the kid that sits at the dinner table and refuses to eat the plate of vegetables. No way I'm eating that broccoli. No way I'm doing. And not only is the kid being disobedient to the parents' instructions which are for the child's well-being, but the kid's missing out on stuff, right? You say you're going to sit at the table till you finish that broccoli. Kid's missing out on maybe watching TV or playing a video game or getting up from the table because he's not willing to bend his will or her will to the parents. Because the kid doesn't understand that the parents' will, the parents' desire is for the well-being of that kid. What it comes down to is a child's happiness, a child's well-being does depend on whether or not they allow their will to bend to the will of their parents, who know better, who want what's best for them. The same principle is true when it comes to spiritual well-being. Are we willing to bend our will to God's will? Are we willing to let God reign over our desires and our wants. Really, to be honest, our salvation comes right down to that, doesn't it? Are we willing to let God make all the decisions for us? A couple of weeks ago, I preached a sermon I called Commit to Submit. And in that lesson, I talked about the fact from 1 John chapter 5, verse 3, that God's commands are not burdensome. And I talked about the fact that God doesn't give us burdensome commands, and there's so many blessings involved. And all of that is true. But the reality is, we have to realize too that that's not always easy. It's not always easy to bend our will to God's will. I'm not saying it's not easy to know what God's will is. I'm saying sometimes it's hard for us just to go, okay, God, that's what you want me to do. That's the decision you want me to do. That's the way you want me to live. I'll do it. So we have to understand, yes, that's important. It matters. We have to submit to God's will. But sometimes that's not that easy. So this morning I want us to look again at that challenge. The challenge that it is to surrender our will to God's will. God knows what's best for us. God seeks our own good. In fact, we lose nothing. In fact, we gain everything when we give our will over to God's will. That's what Jesus means when Jesus says, if any man would come after me, let him deny himself, put self aside, and take up his cross and follow me. But listen, he says this too, for whoever would save his life will lose it. In other words, if you can't let go of your will, your life's not going to work out right, especially spiritually. And whoever loses his life or gives up his will for my sake will find it. That's what Jesus means. Well, Jesus not only teaches this, but Jesus also provides the greatest demonstration of spiritual success that I believe that we can find in Scripture in what happens with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus shows us what it means to submit to God's will. Jesus gives us an example of giving in to God's will in spite of the struggle. Listen, the fact is, it was God's desire. It was God's will to save humanity. But in order for that to happen, Jesus had to pay the sacrifice on the cross. Jesus had to die. And Jesus knew that. And Jesus was willing, and because He was willing to submit His will to the Father's, we have hope today. So I want us to look this morning at Jesus' example of submission. Right? What I want us to see is Jesus' struggle, but also his surrender and His resolve to do the will of the Father. And to see what a difference that ought to make in our lives. It wasn't easy for Jesus. But what we see is an example of being willing to choose to commit ourselves to submit completely to God's will. So let's set the stage right quickly of the time leading up to what happens here in the garden. We know from Scripture that it was the Thursday of the Passover week. It was that evening. And Jesus was in the upper room sharing the Passover meal with His apostles. And Jesus is already feeling grief. He's already feeling the anxiety. He's feeling the stress of what's about to happen. The text tells us that as He shared this meal, He knew He was about to be betrayed. He knew which one would betray Him. He knew this was coming. Yet He shares the meal. By all indications, He washes the feet of Judas, the betrayer. And as the meal progresses, He sits and He listens to those closest to Him, those who He's tried to get across to them. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to be hung on a cross, and I'm going to rise again 3 days later. And He's tried to get this across to them. And at this meal, what are they discussing? It's the Muhammad Ali discussion. I am the greatest. They're arguing over who's the greatest among them. While Jesus is weary with grief, knowing what's in front of Him. Already, literally, the weight of the world, the sins of the world is already on Him, and He knows what's coming. And they sing a song, the text tells us. And they begin to walk across the Kidron Valley to the garden. As they walk to the Mount of Olives, they come across what appears to be apparently a path that turns into what is, by all accounts, an olive grove. Gethsemane means olive press. And this is a place that Jesus is familiar with. John tells us that Jesus often brought His followers there. This is a place that Jesus knows very well. We'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. But as Jesus turns into this garden, we reach a critical point. Now, here's something interesting, just kind of a side note. Gardens play an interesting part in God's relationship with humanity. Creation. Everything begins. Creation and the fall of man, all in the Garden of Eden. We end the Bible, the record of God's revelation to us ends with man in fellowship with God in the Garden of God. Well, between the Garden of Eden in Genesis and the Garden of God in Revelation stands the Garden of Gethsemane. And it is in this garden where Jesus' redemptive mission hits a critical mass. It's at this point where Jesus has to separate Himself from His apostles. And Jesus teaches us some great lessons here. And I'll say it again. It was absolutely God's will to save humanity. But as Jesus at this point certainly knows, has known for years, He has to pay the ultimate sacrifice on the cross. And it's weighing on Him. So as we begin this moment where Jesus separates Himself from all but three and even separates Himself to some degree from those three apostles, let's look and see what we can learn about Jesus in this moment as Jesus begins to address His Father. What I think we can see first and foremost, and I've already mentioned this, but this is hard. This is a challenge for Jesus. There's just no two ways about it. There's no way that we can say this was easy for Jesus to do. Yes, He's the Son of God. Yes, He's known this His entire life. But this is difficult. And we know this is difficult because of what we see in the text. Luke records for us in Luke 22:41 that He knelt. He goes to His knees to begin this time of conversation with His Father. Mark tells us that He fell on the ground. It's a collapse. He hits His knees and falls to the ground to begin to pray. Matthew even tells us that He falls on His face. It's just a complete collapse before the Father. So even His physical description shows us the emotional distress that Jesus is dealing with. But look at the words that describe how Jesus feels in this moment. The British theologian, late British theologian, John R.W. Stott, has a great book called The Cross of Christ that he describes this in such detail. I'm going to steal some of his words right here. But he talks about how Jesus feels. The text tells us, and Luke says that Jesus felt that He was in an agony. Not just in agony, He was in an agony. He was in a state of consternation, a state of appalled reluctance. Matthew and Mark use the word troubled. It tells us that Jesus was troubled in His spirit, a word that means a loathing aversion, perhaps not unmixed with despondency. Do you see the picture? This is not an easy moment. This is Jesus in emotional anguish right now as He has this conversation with His Father. Mark uses the expression, He's deeply distressed. That's been translated horror-struck. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 7 even tells us that Jesus cried out to His Father with loud cries and tears. So we see the emotional state of Jesus from what the text tells us. But let's look at what Jesus Himself says In Matthew chapter 26, He says, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. The word sorrowful there is a word that describes a mental pain, a distress which hems him in on every side, from which there is therefore no escape. My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. So what's the source? Why? I mean, we know, but what exactly is the source of this emotional distress for Jesus? Well, Jesus says, let this cup pass from me. So we have to ask the question, what is this cup that Jesus is talking about? Well, Mark gives us an interesting description in Mark chapter 14, verses 35 and 36. What that is. Mark chapter 14 says, he went a little farther and he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. Mark equates the hour with, or the cup with the hour. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me, this hour. What is this hour? Jesus understands full well that this is now the time to undertake that action for which He came to this earth. He says, let this, if there's any way, let this hour pass from me. Let this cup pass from me. As Jesus contemplates this hour, there's obvious anguish. Now, some of us might look at this and just say, man, he's just scared to die. He knows what's coming. And I mean, and that would be plausible from a strictly human perspective. That this hour, he knows this hour is going to mean his crucifixion. But when we think about some details about Jesus, it just seems that that's too simple. What does Jesus know? Jesus knows about the afterlife. He knows where He's going when this is all over. He's going back to the Father. And so you think about that. You also think about just the moral courage that Jesus has shown the entire time He's been on earth. He's shown no fear. He's said for months, for almost years, He said, I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to be crucified. He knows what's coming. So the idea of just being afraid of death to me just doesn't make sense. Now we know again from Hebrews chapter 5 verse 7 that it says that He cried out with prayers and supplication with loud cries and tears to Him who was able to save him from death. It sounds like maybe if you read that He might be trying to save Himself from death. But when we think about Jesus' death, it's just different. Jesus' death is not the same. His death was unlike, this hour, this cup was unlike anything anyone else has ever suffered. Because as Jesus faces this hour, He bears the sins of humanity. The sins of all those who are alive at His time, and the sins of me and you, and the sins of everyone to come. He also has been rejected. He's been despised. He's been made fun of. He's been humiliated by those for whom He is making this sacrifice. The people in front of Him, the people that He's lived with, the people that He knows. They've rejected Him. And above all that, He knows that His Father will turn His face away. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus' grief facing death is unlike any death that has ever happened. And it's interesting that Jesus uses this term, let this cup pass from me. Because we know from the Old Testament, from Job 21 and from Ezekiel 23, that the cup is often used as a way to describe God's wrath. So it seems clear that Jesus, as He's in anguish about this cup, understands that He Himself is going to be bearing the wrath of God against sin. And He says, let this cup pass from me. If we're honest, I guess if I'm honest, I look at this moment with Jesus, and it's a little troubling, kind of. You know, when we see Jesus in this despair and in this anxiety, it kind of makes us scratch our heads a little bit. Because to me, what I think, well, isn't Jesus the one who in Matthew chapter 6, verse 25, Jesus is the one that says, do not be anxious about your life. Jesus taught against being anxious. But let's be clear. What Jesus is talking about, He's talking about the worry that consumes us. He's talking about the worry that we worry and we stress over things that we can't control. And it's a worry, it's an anxiety that can damage our faith. Because Jesus Himself will go on in Matthew chapter 6 in that same section in verse 34, and He'll say, sufficient is the day for its own trouble. In other words, sometimes the hour has to be borne. Sometimes we have to bear the weight of the hour. Life can be hard. And sometimes we have to just bear through it. I think that's what Jesus is doing in this moment. He's not despairing in His faith. He's not rejecting His Father. We'll see that in a moment. He's getting through this hour because it has to be done. What we can't do is get trapped by other emotions. What we can't do is get to a point where we despair and we struggle with our faith. So in this, we have to ask, okay, how do we do that? Jesus in this moment, I believe, provides us 4 tools, and we'll close with those. 4 tools that will help us as we're challenged to submit to the will of God. As Jesus is in this moment in prayer, I think the first tool that's the most obvious one that we can take from Jesus is the idea of prayer. Jesus goes to this place that is a place of solitude, is a place of seclusion. I think what we can take from this is it's important to have a regular place and a regular time to pray. I mentioned a minute ago, John tells us that Jesus would come there often, would bring His followers there. John chapter 18, verse 2. Luke tells us that it was Jesus' custom to come here. It's important to have a place to pray. It's important to have a set time to pray, to build that habit of coming before God, to always be in communication with God. That's that idea of pray without ceasing. So we're always in this communication, but there needs to be those times where we set aside and say, I'm going to take this moment, whether it's in the car on the way to work or wherever it is, that this is just my prayer time. This is just me and God. That's what Jesus does in the Garden of Gethsemane. But we can also take another aspect of prayer that we can take is the comfort level that we have with God. Jesus uses an expression that is just a beautiful expression. He says, Abba, Father. He uses an Aramaic word and a Greek word. And when we combine those two together, what he's saying, the closest we can come to it in English, is Father, dear Father. Jesus is using a term that shows like the confidence a child would have in their father. He's showing an intimacy that's available with God. Now, this intimacy is unique. It didn't come along. You didn't hear this talked about. You didn't hear God addressed this way until Jesus comes along. And there's something to be said that this may be exclusive to Jesus, this term. But I think what Jesus does show us is that we have that sort of relationship. We have a Father who tells us to ask, seek, and knock. Jesus says, fall on your knees in that special place, in that special moment, and go to your Father, dear Father, and ask and seek and knock. So another aspect of prayer too that I think we see from that expression right there is the persistence in prayer. You notice 3 times in the section that Trevor read for us, 3 times Jesus goes to the Father and makes this request. Jesus lived that. But Jesus taught that. He taught that in the parable of the persistent widow. You recall where the widow goes to the judge over and over until it literally says the judge finally just gives in. Keep asking. Jesus teaches this in the parable of the friend at midnight, where the friend comes to his friend's house and says, hey, I need some food. And the friend says, go away. But Jesus says, keep asking. And that's why I believe we see in Matthew chapter 7, 7 through 11, that Jesus uses that expression, ask, seek, and knock. That grows in intensity. I don't think Jesus used those terms on accident. He says to ask and then to keep seeking and then to knock. What's He telling us? When we go to God, when we go to our Father, dear Father, go to Him in confidence. Not that you're trying to bug God to death to get Him to give in. It's that you show we know to whom we have to go. Go to God in prayer, in persistent, regular prayer. So there's the tool of prayer. There's also a tool that Jesus teaches us when He uses this term, watch. Jesus teaches us to be watchful. He says here, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me in Matthew chapter 26. What He's telling there, He's telling Peter, James, and John, He's separated from them. He's got Peter, James, and John fairly close, but the other 8 apostles are out a little further away. I think in this context, Jesus is simply saying He doesn't want to be caught off guard. He's saying stand guard, make sure nobody shows up. He needs this time with His Father. So He says, you guys watch, just be on guard. But then in chapter 26, verse 41, when He comes back and finds these guys asleep, He says again, watch and pray so that you may not enter into temptation. Indeed, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Here He's telling them to focus. They're asleep. That's one of those things I've always kind of read and went, man, those guys, what a terrible thing to do to Jesus. He's off sweating blood, and you're falling asleep. But Luke gives us a little bit more information. Luke chapter 22, verse 45 says they were sleeping for sorrow. Maybe that's why Jesus was bothered. Maybe that's why Jesus was so irritated by them sleeping, because they were depressed. So when Jesus uses this expression, watch, when He tells them to watch, and then He tells them to watch and pray, what's He telling us? He tells us we got to be focused. We've got to be attentive to what's going on in the world around us. When it comes to our relationship with God, when it comes to our relationship with others, we've got to pay attention. We can't get down. Yes, we're going to make mistakes. These guys made a mistake. They weren't watching. But Jesus is telling them to focus. Be attentive to the things that He's asked them to do. He doesn't want them to despair. Why is that? Because when we start to despair, we can get down. It opens the doors to sin. It opens the door to doubt. It opens the door to us just to say, I can't do this. Jesus says, be on guard. Be watchful in your prayer life, but in your everyday life. Be attentive. Jesus also teaches tool number 3, tool of prayer, the tool of watchfulness. He also gives us number 3. He tells us that there is value in being prepared. Now, listen, I don't mean this flippantly by any means, but you'll note that the timing of this prayer, the setting here is significant. Jesus is praying this prayer, let this cup pass from me, well before He's on the cross. He's praying before the trial comes. He's prepared. I think back to those 2004 failure Olympics. We were introduced that year to a young swimmer, a guy named Michael Phelps, who in that very Olympics, those terrible Olympics, here's what he did. He tied the record of 8 medals in a single Olympic Games. He won 6 gold and 2 bronze. 4 years later, he won 8 golds at the 2008 Beijing Games, broke Mark Spitz's record from 1972. In 2012 in London, he won 4 gold and 2 silver. It's kind of an off year there. And in 2016 in Rio de Janeiro, he won 5 gold and 1 silver. He's the most successful athlete 4 Olympics in a row in history. This guy swims, or when he was training still, swam about 7 miles a day. I bet I haven't swam 7 miles in my life. About 50 miles a week, 6 to 7 days a week. Birthdays, holidays, didn't matter. Dude was swimming. That doesn't include also 3 days a week in the gym doing weight training. Also includes ice baths, massages, 8 to 9 hours of sleep, vital to his success. While he's training, you may have heard this, while he's in training, he ate 8 to 10,000 calories a day. That would be it for me one day. There's no way I could burn that many calories in one day. But that meant a lot of early mornings, a lot of long, tough days, a lot of focus, a lot of preparation. And it paid off. I mean, guy's got to be in pretty good shape just to wear those medals around his neck. And I think that's just one Olympics. Preparation pays off. Same thing for us spiritually. These tools that Jesus gives us, this example Jesus shows us that we're going to deal with trials, we're going to deal with struggles, we have to prepare. We've got to be praying before the trial comes. We've got to be ready to do whatever it is that's coming our way before it hits. We've got to have the relationship with God established before it happens. Well, how do we do that? The last tool I think Jesus gives us in this is His incredible faith. His incredible confidence in His Father, dear Father. Mark 14:36, He says, Abba, Father, all things are possible with you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will. Many times Jesus talks about that with God all things are impossible. That tells us He knows who He has to take this prayer to. He knows where His source of strength is. And He knows He can confidently ask this. But He also shows the spiritual fortitude to be able to say, not my will, God, but your will be done. What incredible faith. To the point that he leaves this garden after this moment, after this time of prayer, with a resolute focus, with absolute confidence, knowing what's in front of him. To the point that even as he comes out of the garden and Peter, bless his heart, Peter steps up and pulls his sword and slices off some guy's ear. John chapter 18 tells us that Jesus said to Peter, put your sword away. Am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me? He has made his decision. It's time. It's time. Jesus is our great example of everything. But when it comes to spiritual success, Jesus is the greatest example of unwavering submission to the Father's will. Doesn't mean it's easy. Wasn't easy for Him. But it means with the tools that He provides us, it is possible for us to be just as resolute, just as steadfast in our commitment to say, not your will, not my will, but your will be done in everything. Jesus knew He had to face the cross. He knew He had to die. To the Romans, Jesus was one of 1,000 criminals who were crucified. To the Jews, Jesus was a blasphemer who was getting what He deserved. How did the Father look at Jesus? Not just in this moment in Gethsemane, but after he submitted to the Father's will. How does God look at Jesus? Hebrews chapter 5, verses 8 and 9 tell us that he learned obedience from what he suffered. After he was perfected, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. He's a great example of one who's willing to commit completely to submission to God's will, even when it's hard. And he's also the source of eternal salvation. So the question for you this morning is, are you willing to submit to God's will? True spiritual success is defined in that. There's a lot of elements to it. We understand that. But true spiritual success is being willing to say, Father, dear Father, not my will but yours. Maybe this morning you're at that point. Maybe you're ready to put Christ on in baptism. Maybe as a Christian, you've got some concerns about your own spiritual success. If you have any questions, any need, if you're visiting with us, have any questions about anything you've seen, heard this morning, whatever you need. If you want to come forward while we stand in just a minute and sing this song, you can do that. If not, just grab somebody and let's talk about it. Let's talk about being truly successful spiritually. Anything you need, let us know while we stand and sing.